Let me tell you about the day Edith Callahan lost everything and found something worth so much more. And I want you to stay with me because this story doesn't go where you think it's going to go. Edith was 73 years old when her daughter Pamela disowned her, and it happened because of one single argument about a man named Douglas. And before you judge her, before you say, well, why did she get involved? You need to understand what kind of woman Edith was. She had worked for 42 years as a school teacher and then a librarian. She was the kind of woman who read the newspapers every morning, and the kind of woman who noticed things other people missed, and the kind of woman who believed you had a responsibility to speak up when you saw something wrong. So when she caught Douglas, Pamela's husband of 19 years, at the Continental Hotel in Hartford with a woman who wasn't his wife, Edith didn't hesitate. She followed them into the lobby. She watched them get into the elevator together. She wrote down the date and the time, and then she drove to Pamela's house on a Tuesday afternoon in the spring of 1969, and she sat down at Pamela's kitchen table, and she told her daughter what she'd seen. Not with anger. Edith never did anything with anger. She told her with sadness, the way you'd tell someone their house was on fire. She said, "Pamela, I saw Douglas at the Continental Hotel on Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon with another woman. I watched them go upstairs together. I'm telling you because you deserve to know the truth, and I love you, and I can't be your mother and let you live a lie." Now, here's where it gets interesting, and this is where you need to understand something about how people work. Pamela didn't cry. Pamela didn't ask questions. Pamela got angry. She said Edith was jealous of Douglas, that she'd always been jealous of him, that she was a controlling old woman who couldn't stand to see her daughter happy. She said Edith had come to sabotage her marriage because Edith's own life was empty. Words got louder. Edith tried to explain that she wasn't there to hurt her, but Pamela wasn't listening. Pamela said, "If you walk out that door, you don't come back here. You're not welcome anymore. I don't want to see you. I don't want to hear from you. As far as I'm concerned, you're dead to me." And then Edith, who was 64 years old at the time, who had raised this girl, who had bandaged her knees and helped her with homework, and walked her down the aisle at her own wedding, Edith got up and she walked out that door. She didn't slam it. She just closed it quietly, and she walked to her car and she drove away. That was in 1969, and Pamela meant every word she said. But here's the thing that makes this even worse, and here's why Edith's pain wasn't just about being rejected by her daughter. 2 years before that argument, in 1967, Edith had done something that she'd never done before and would regret for the rest of her life. She had sold her house. The house she'd lived in for 38 years. The house where she'd raised Pamela after her husband died. The house that had everything she owned in it. She sold it for $92,000, and she gave $48,000 of that money to Pamela and Douglas for a down payment on Douglas's business venture, a restaurant. Douglas said he'd always wanted to run a restaurant. He said he had a location picked out and a menu designed and connections with suppliers. He said with $48,000 he could open in 6 months and they'd be wealthy within 3 years. Edith believed him. She gave him the money. The restaurant never opened. Not in 6 months, not in a year, not ever. Douglas spent the money. Some of it went to a lease deposit, and some of it went to renovations, and some of it went, and you can guess this part, to paying for time with the woman he was meeting at the Continental Hotel. Pamela knew. Think about that. Pamela knew that Douglas was spending their money on his affair, and she didn't confront him, and she didn't leave him, and she didn't ask for the money back. And when her mother, the woman who had given everything, tried to warn her, Pamela turned on her instead. So when Edith walked out of Pamela's house that day in 1969, she had lost more than her daughter. She had lost her home, her savings, her place in the world. She had $48.72 in her purse. That's all. After 2 years of the disowned life in Hartford, living in a boarding house where the walls were thin and the hallway smelled like someone else's dinner, Working part-time at the Hartford Public Library for $12 a week, Edith got tired of it. She was tired of seeing people on the street who knew about her situation. She was tired of the pity in their eyes. She was tired of Hartford. She was tired of staying where everything reminded her of what she'd lost. So one morning in the summer of 1971, she packed a suitcase with clothes and books and 3 photographs. One of her husband who had died in 1954, one of Pamela as a child, one of herself at her college graduation. She had $647 saved by working overtime at the library. She bought a Greyhound bus ticket to nowhere in particular, and she got on that bus, and she didn't get off until the bus pulled into a town called Blackstone Falls, Connecticut, population 4,847. She got off, and she looked around at the wide streets and the brick buildings from the 1800s and the mill that wasn't running anymore, and she felt something shift in her chest. It was peace, not happiness. Peace. She didn't want remarkable. She didn't want recovery and vindication and the chance to prove to Pamela that she'd made it anyway. She wanted small and forgotten, a place where nobody knew her story and nobody pitied her, and nobody expected anything from her. She wanted to disappear. She rented a room above a hardware store owned by a woman named Nora Briggs, a widow who was 65 years old and had good coffee and didn't ask questions. $8 a week. She got a job at the Blackstone Falls Public Library, a building that had been built in 1923 and had high ceilings and tall windows and books that had been checked out maybe twice in 10 years. The library paid $12 a week. She was surviving. Not thriving. Surviving. She shelved books in the morning. She helped old men read the newspaper in the afternoon. She had dinner at the boarding house at 5:30, usually soup and bread, sometimes a chicken leg. She went to bed at 9. She woke at 6. This was her life. And it was better than Hartford. And it was better than staying where she didn't belong. Then, one Thursday morning in October 1971, 3 months after she arrived in Blackstone Falls, she saw a notice on the library bulletin board. It was typed on a piece of cream-colored paper with the Ashworth's auction house letterhead at the top. It said there was an estate auction scheduled for 10 o'clock the following Saturday. 3 acres of land in the valley on the outskirts of town with a structure. The description was brief because nobody wanted it. The opening bid was $1. Edith read it 3 times, and then she took it down from the bulletin board, and she kept it. She read it again that night before bed. She read it again in the morning. She didn't plan to go. She had no reason to go. But on Saturday morning at 9:45, she put on her shoes and started walking. The walk took 30 minutes. Ashworth's auction house was a long brick building with a dirt parking lot that had maybe 15 cars in it. Through the windows, she could see people sitting in folding chairs, men mostly in work clothes, people who looked at property for a living. She almost turned around. She almost went back to the library. But she kept walking. Inside, the auction house was cooler than outside, and it smelled like dust and old wood. A man was standing at a podium. He was 68 years old, she would find out later, and his name was Frank Tavares, and he had been running Ashworth's for 30 years. Frank had seen everything. He'd sold farms and factories and houses full of dead people's belongings. He knew people showed up who didn't know what they were looking at, who came because they were bored or curious or looking for a miracle. But when Edith came in, a 73-year-old woman in a gray coat carrying a purse that had seen better days, Frank looked at her, and he did something he didn't usually do. He offered her coffee, not the weak stuff from the waiting room in a styrofoam cup. Real coffee. He poured it from a thermos into a ceramic mug, and he handed it to her, and he said, "You're new in town." They sat together before the auction started, and Edith told him about the library job, about the room above the hardware store, about the fact that she was living on $12 a week and trying not to think too hard, about the daughter who didn't want her anymore. She didn't give him all the details. She was private. But she gave him enough for him to understand that this was a woman who had lost something and was trying to learn to live without it. Frank listened because Frank knew about loss. Frank had been married to a woman named Catherine for 43 years. They'd had 2 children together, both grown and living in other states. Then, 5 years before, Catherine had died of cancer over the course of 18 months, and Frank had learned that the world could take everything from you and then keep taking. He'd learned that you had to find a reason to keep showing up. So Frank understood what Edith was doing in Blackstone Falls, and he understood why she'd come to the auction, and he understood that maybe the universe had reasons for these things that we don't see until later. When the auction started, there were maybe 20 people in the room, and Frank worked through the lots with the efficiency of a man who had done this 1,000 times. There were estate items, dishes and furniture and oil paintings that nobody wanted, and then Frank got to the last lot. He showed her the description on a piece of paper. 3 acres of land in the valley outside Blackstone Falls. The photograph was from 1965, so it was 6 years old by now. In the photograph, there was an overgrown field, and on it was the skeleton of a greenhouse. The structure was metal framework, and you could see the shadows where glass panels had been. Everything was covered in vines. The description said it had been built in 1898 by a man named Dr. Harlan Moss, who had come to Blackstone Falls from Yale University to study the native plants that grew in the valley. Dr. Moss had been a botanist, which meant he studied plants, and he had apparently been serious about his work. He'd built this greenhouse to house rare specimens that grew in the valley. He'd lived in a stone cottage on the property. But Dr. Moss had died in 1921, 50 years before, and his family didn't want the land. They'd never wanted it. So it had been seized for back taxes, and it had been sitting there for 6 years, and nobody had bid on it. The opening bid was $1. $1. Frank looked at Edith, and Edith looked at the photograph, and she raised her hand. No one else did. Frank looked at the other buyers to see if anyone would challenge her, and nobody did, because it was worthless land with a ruined greenhouse, and nobody in their right mind wanted it. Frank said, "Going once, going twice, sold to the lady in the gray coat for $1. Edith's heart was beating very fast, and she didn't know why. Frank helped her with the paperwork. He was patient with her as she signed her name on the deed and initialed the survey. She was now the owner of 3 acres of land and a greenhouse that didn't exist anymore. The recording fee was $45. The survey was already included. She paid Frank from her purse, and she had $3 left. Frank offered her a ride in his truck, and she accepted. They drove out of town on a road that wound up into the hills, and then Frank turned onto a smaller road, and then onto a dirt road, and then he pulled over at a gate that was hanging from a post by a single hinge. Frank opened it. Frank. They drove through. The property stretched out in front of them, and it was even worse than the photograph. The metal framework of the greenhouse was twisted and green with verdigris. That's the blue-green patina that forms on old copper and brass. The glass panels had fallen and were buried under leaves and dirt and bird droppings and 40 years of decay. The entire structure was sinking into itself, collapsing gradually down toward the earth like it was being swallowed. Behind the collapsed greenhouse was a stone cottage, and the cottage was also in ruins. The roof had partially caved. Vines had grown up the walls. The front door was hanging open, and inside you could see only darkness. The land itself was wild and beautiful, in a way that made Edith's chest hurt. Trees had grown up through everything. There were stone foundations from older structures, maybe a barn, maybe a house, maybe something else that had been forgotten. Wildflowers were growing everywhere. The valley opened out in all directions, and you could see mountains in the distance, blue and soft in the afternoon light. Frank parked the truck, and they got out, and they stood there looking at it, and Edith started to cry. Not loud crying, just tears running down her face. Frank didn't say anything. He just put his hand on her shoulder, and he said, "You'll figure it out. People like you always do." They stood together for a while, and then Frank said he'd let her walk around if she wanted. He gave her some time alone. Edith walked through the overgrown land. She walked past the cottage. She walked toward the collapsed greenhouse because something was pulling her toward it, some instinct she didn't understand and couldn't name. The grass was tall and wet from recent rain. Her shoes got soaked. She didn't care. She walked into what had been the center of the greenhouse, where the soil had caved in and the metal framework was reaching up like broken bones, and that's when she saw it. In the center of the collapsed floor there was an iron hatch. It was round, about 3 feet across, and it was made of heavy iron, the kind of iron that could last forever if it needed to. There was a padlock on it. The lock was rusted red-brown, but it was still closed. The hatch was leading down into darkness. Edith stood there, and she didn't move. Frank came over and stood beside her, and they both looked down into that darkness, and neither of them said anything. What was underneath? What had Dr. Harlan Moss been doing with a locked iron hatch in the middle of his greenhouse? What was he hiding? Why had he made it so secure? Why had it survived when everything else had fallen apart? Edith looked at Frank, and Frank looked back at her, and then she walked to the edge of that hatch, and she started to smile. The padlock had rusted solid after more than 40 years, and it took 3 people and a bolt cutter to get it open. Nora Briggs came out to help on a Saturday morning in late October, bringing her own tools because she'd been running the hardware store for 23 years, and she'd learned a long time ago that most problems in the world could be solved with the right equipment and a little stubborn determination. See, Nora wasn't just a store owner. She was the kind of woman who knew every person in Blackstone Falls and what they needed before they even asked for it. When Edith mentioned the hatch, Nora showed up with a professional bolt cutter, heavy-duty gloves, and the attitude of someone who'd cut through worse than 40 years of rust. It took them 40 minutes and a lot of swearing before the bolt cutter finally went through the chain, and the sound it made was harsh and metal on metal, echoing across the property like a gunshot. When the lock finally fell away, nobody moved for a moment. You could feel the weight of it. Something was about to change, and everybody standing there knew it. The hatch had a handle welded to its surface, thick cast iron pitted with rust and corrosion that told you exactly how long this thing had been sitting here, untouched. Frank gripped it first and pulled, and the hatch gave way with a long, screaming sound of metal on metal that hadn't moved in decades, a noise so loud that Frank actually flinched. It lifted open to reveal a concrete staircase descending into absolute darkness, and for a second there was nothing but black. There was a smell coming up from below, not terrible, but strange, earthy and old, and like something that had been sealed away from the world for a very long time. It was the smell of underground places, of earth and moisture and age and preservation, the kind of smell that makes you realize how different the world is just a few feet beneath your feet. Edith found a flashlight in Frank's truck, one of those big aluminum ones that still worked, even though it hadn't been used in months. She switched it on and tested the beam, and when she pointed it down into that darkness, the concrete stairs below suddenly appeared, leading down at a steep angle. Behind her came Frank and then Nora, and they descended slowly, their footsteps echoing on the concrete, their shadows stretching long and strange on the walls beside them. The stairs were steep and uneven, and the concrete had cracked in places where the earth beneath had shifted over the decades. The air got colder as they went down, and the smell got stronger, and there was a moment, about halfway down, where Nora actually stopped and said, "Is this wise?" But Edith kept going, and the other two followed. When they reached the bottom, Edith turned the flashlight up and forward, and what she saw made her forget how to breathe. The space beneath the greenhouse was massive, at least 50 feet across and 40 feet deep, and the ceiling was 12 feet high, made of stone that was fitted so precisely that you could barely see the mortar between the blocks. Think about that for a second. This wasn't some amateur hole dug in the earth. This was architecture. This was engineering. The walls were also stone, laid in careful rows and sealed against moisture with what looked like tar or pitch that had held perfectly for over 100 years. Along the perimeter of the space, long raised beds made from slate and timber held soil that was still dark and rich-looking, as if it had just been prepared yesterday instead of 40 years ago. Above the beds ran a complex system of mirrors and glass tubes, angled so that they would capture light from the greenhouse above and funnel it down into the underground space below, a system that was so smart, so thought through, that even Frank, who wasn't particularly technical, stopped and stared at it like he was looking at something impossible. Copper pipes ran along the walls at shoulder height, corroded green but still intact, and when Frank pressed his hand against one of them, he said, "Still cold? There's water moving through these." His voice had changed. You could hear the awe in it, the recognition that he was standing in the presence of something extraordinary. Following the pipes along the wall, they came to a section where an underground spring had been diverted and channeled into a stone-lined trough that ran the length of the space. The engineering was so sophisticated, so precise, so deliberately constructed, that it spoke to a lifetime of knowledge and skill and planning. This wasn't someone who dug a hole. This was someone who understood hydrology and soil composition and light refraction and the needs of plants grown in underground conditions. Frank stopped walking and just stared. "This man wasn't a botanist," he said quietly, and there was something in his voice like reverence. This was an engineer. This was someone who understood architecture and mechanics and soil composition. This was someone with serious training. This was someone with a vision. Along every available surface, shelves carved into the stone walls themselves, stands made from wrought iron, tables constructed from thick wood that had somehow resisted rot in this dry underground air. There were glass jars, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. They were filled with seeds, dried bulbs, pressed plants, dried flowers, leaves preserved in what looked like paper or cloth, specimens collected and stored with the kind of care that suggested someone who'd understood that these were not just plants, but records, documents, evidence of a life spent in pursuit of something larger than himself. Each jar was labeled in meticulous handwriting, and the labels read like poetry, like a man speaking to the future. Cattleya gigantea, Venezuela, 1892. Papaver somniferum, Afghanistan, 1878. Salix alba, medicinal, bark-dried, 1903. Digitalis purpurea, heart medicine, seeds, 1911. Orchis mascula, Welsh Mountains, 1889. Pythiopedilum rothschildianum, Borneo, hybrid third generation, 1898. The labels went on and on, covering decades of what could only be described as obsessive collection, and not just collection, documentation. Every specimen was marked with where it came from, when it was collected, what it was used for. This was the record of a man trying to preserve something, trying to keep knowledge alive, trying to document botanical science in an era when women in positions of authority didn't exist, and independent research was practically impossible. Edith walked slowly between the shelves, running her finger along the labels, and Frank followed her, his face growing more and more stunned with each jar he examined. He would pick up a jar, read the label, set it down carefully, and move to the next one, and you could see his mind working, calculating, recognizing, understanding what he was looking at. In a corner of the space, set up like a scholar's workspace, was a reading table made from oak, and on the table were leather-bound journals, lined up in chronological order like a testimony, laid out in careful progression. The first was labeled 1878 in careful script on the spine. The last was labeled 1921, 13 journals, 13 volumes documenting over 40 years of work by a man who'd created this place and lived in it and filled it with his life's effort. Frank opened one from the middle, 1898, and read aloud, "The specimen of Paphiopedilum rothschildianum obtained from the merchant in Borneo has produced viable seedlings in the growing medium of peat and bark. The underground cultivation space maintains optimal humidity at 92% and temperature at a stable 64 degrees through the spring circulation system. Third-generation hybrid of the slipper orchid now shows characteristics of both parent plants and produces flowers of extraordinary color variation. The work proceeds according to plan. The cold heart grows quiet when focused on matters of precision." Frank's voice dropped when he read that last sentence, and he stopped and looked up from the page. That was grief talking. That was a man who'd lost everything and found a way to channel it into something that would last. Frank closed the journal slowly and looked at Edith and Nora. "This man," he said, and his voice was shaking slightly, actual emotion from a practical county clerk, was conducting botanical research that would rival university programs. He was producing hybrid specimens, documenting his methodology, preserving genetic material. He was doing work that would take a team of researchers years to accomplish. Do you understand what this means? He was doing cutting-edge science here, underground, alone, for over 40 years. He was creating specimens that probably don't exist anywhere else in the world. They spent the entire afternoon examining the space, and I want you to understand what that means. They spent hours moving from jar to jar, from journal to journal, slowly understanding the scope of what one man had created. Frank consulted by phone with a colleague at the Botanical Garden in New Haven, a woman who specialized in rare orchids, and as she told him the values of different specimens, he grew quieter and quieter. According to the final journal entry from 1921, Dr. Harlan Moss had come to Blackstone Falls in 1878 from his position at Yale. He'd been respected in his field, a researcher with access to specimens from around the world, with colleagues and standing in the academic community. His wife Sarah had died of tuberculosis in 1880, just 2 years after they'd arrived, and the entries after that date changed. The handwriting got tighter. The observations became more detailed, more precise, more obsessive. After her death, he'd begun constructing the underground laboratory, and he'd spent 23 years, from 1878 to 1901, digging and building, creating the space almost entirely by himself or with hired help that he paid, and then asked to stay quiet about it. The journal entries described his grief in careful, measured language, the way he'd channeled his loss into the work, how the plants and the seeds had become a kind of immortality project for him, a way of saying that Sarah's death wouldn't be the end of everything he cared about. He would write entries like, "The new hybrid shows Sarah's strength, the red color she loved," or "The medicinal collection grows. Perhaps something here will help others avoid her fate." This was a man using science as therapy, preservation as grief work, and creating something genuinely important in the process. The collection included rare orchids worth, Frank said after consulting more carefully with his colleague, somewhere between $60,000 and $90,000. In 1921 money. Think about that. This wasn't a wealthy man doing a hobby. This was someone who'd invested money he didn't have, time he could never get back, and emotional labor beyond measure into creating something of genuine value. The medicinal plant collection, including specimens of plants that were now endangered or extinct in the wild, he estimated at another $30,000 to $40,000. The journals themselves, Frank said, touching the leather spine of one with reverent fingers like he was touching something sacred, were priceless. They documented a completely unknown botanist's lifetime of hybridization research, a man whose work had never been published, never been shared with the scientific community, never been credited or recognized. Universities would fight over these, Seed banks would pay fortunes for them. Botanical gardens would see them as treasures. Someone had left behind, unknown and undocumented, what amounted to a major botanical archive, a record of a life, of a grief, of a man trying to make meaning out of loss. Pamela arrived on a Tuesday morning in the middle of November, and Douglas was with her, which should have told Edith everything she needed to know right there. Frank learned later that a real estate agent Douglas knew had mentioned the property sale at a county office, a 3-acre parcel that had just been acquired for $1 at auction. Douglas, being the kind of man who couldn't pass up the idea of something valuable that might have been overlooked, had done a title search and discovered that the property was owned by a 73-year-old woman who'd recently moved to Blackstone Falls. It didn't take much investigation to figure out who she was. Douglas had made the connection, put together the story, and decided that this might be worth his time, which meant he'd called Pamela and said something like, "There might be something here we can use," which is exactly the kind of phrase that makes people like Pamela show up with that specific expression on their face, calculating, hungry, ready to pounce. Pamela's face went white when she saw the laboratory, and Edith watched her daughter's eyes move across the space, the careful construction, the jars of seeds, the journals, the evidence of 40 years of obsessive care and attention to something that had nothing to do with money or profit or any of the things Pamela cared about. Edith could see her daughter's mind working, trying to figure out if there was money here, if there was something to take, if there was value that could be converted into cash or leverage or advantage. "What is this?" Pamela asked, and her voice had changed from the last time Edith had heard it. There was something sharp in it now, something that suggested she'd already started calculating. "It belongs to Dr. Harlan Moss," Edith said calmly. "He built it. It's been here since before you were born. It's his life's work." "I know that," Pamela snapped. "But what is it really? What's the value?" And there it was. Not how remarkable, not what incredible research, not any appreciation for what she was looking at. Just, what's the value? Frank stepped forward. He was standing right there, and he'd heard the entire exchange, and he'd seen the look in Pamela's eyes. "The seeds alone are worth $60,000 to $90,000, he said, his voice measured and factual. "The medicinal plant collection is worth $30,000 to $40,000. The journals are scientifically invaluable. There are universities that would pay substantial sums just for the right to study them and publish the research." Pamela's face changed. Frank watched it happen in real time, the calculation beginning behind her eyes, the assessment of what was in front of her shifting instantly from curious question to dollar signs. You could see the moment her brain decided this was worth fighting over. "This is family property," Pamela said, and her voice had taken on that sharp edge that Edith remembered from the day she'd been thrown out, the voice of someone who'd decided to be ugly and was committing to it completely. "My family's history. This should be mine. This should come to me. That woman was married to my father. That makes this inheritance, doesn't it? That makes this mine." Frank Tavares, who had been a county clerk for 32 years before he retired, and who had seen every variety of human greed and desperation and delusion walk through his office door, spoke in a voice that was quiet, but absolutely final, the voice of someone who'd seen this play 1,000 times and knew exactly how it ended. "This woman," he said, gesturing to Edith, and his voice didn't rise at all, which was somehow more devastating than if he'd shouted, "Purchase this property at legal auction for $1. I was present as a witness. The deed is recorded with the town. The property is hers. Everything on the property, above ground and below ground, above the stone and beneath it, everything that exists within those property lines belongs to her. She can do whatever she wants with it. She can sell it. She can keep it. She can donate it to a university. She can burn it down if she wants. What she does not do is answer to you. If you think you have a legal claim to this property or to the contents of this space, I suggest you consult with an attorney. Any attorney. In fact, I'd be delighted to recommend one. And I should tell you that I have 32 years of county clerk experience and complete documentation of every step of this transaction. I've offered to testify regarding the legality of the sale and the mental competence of the buyer. I don't think a courtroom confrontation will be a pleasant experience for you." Pamela opened her mouth, and then she looked at Edith's face, and she saw something there that made her close it again. She saw certainty. She saw finality. She saw a woman who'd stopped being anyone's victim and had made peace with it. Douglas, for his part, looked uncomfortable. The expression of a man who'd been hoping for easy money, not a legal confrontation with a retired county clerk who actually knew the law. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other and looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. Edith walked to the hatch, moving with the kind of calm that comes from knowing you've already won, and she said, very calmly and very clearly, "Close it. Lock it." Frank closed the hatch and secured it with a new padlock that Nora brought from the hardware store the next day, a heavy-duty commercial lock that you couldn't cut through without real equipment. Pamela and Douglas left Blackstone Falls without saying another word. They drove away on that November morning, and Edith never heard from them again. No letters, no phone calls, no attempts at reconciliation or legal action. They simply disappeared, which suggested to Frank that Douglas had made a quick calculation of his own and realized that this wasn't a fight he could win. Edith called a contractor named Marcus Webb, who'd built 3 houses on the outskirts of town and was known for solid work and keeping his mouth shut. She asked him if he could rebuild a greenhouse on top of the hatch, something functional, something that would look right and would blend with what was already there, but that would also allow access to the space below without making it obvious to anyone just passing by. Marcus came out, looked at the site, looked at the journals and the architectural drawings that Dr. Harlan Moss had left behind over 100 years ago, and quoted her $15,000. Edith had $42,000 left from the sale of the rare orchids to the Yale Botanical Garden. Frank had negotiated that for her, making sure she got fair market value, and another $14,000 from the university research program that had bought the medicinal herb seeds to study and possibly cultivate. She had savings that no one knew about, money she'd hidden away over the years in small amounts, emergency money that she'd never told Pamela about because Pamela had a way of knowing when money existed and extracting it through whatever means necessary. She paid Marcus Webb cash, $15,000 in bills, and he built her a greenhouse that was both beautiful and functional, with a system of wooden beams that could be lifted to provide access to the hatch below without requiring the entire structure to come apart. The greenhouse had skylights and a stone floor, and the appearance of a working botanical space, which it was. Edith actually grew plants there, herbs and specimens that caught her interest. But beneath it lay the laboratory, the archive, the life work of a man who'd died nearly 100 years ago. The underground laboratory became Edith's classroom. She began inviting students from the agricultural extension program to visit by appointment, bringing them down into that stone space to see how one man had engineered solutions to botanical problems, how he'd created hybrid specimens that shouldn't have existed, how he'd preserved knowledge for a century. She opened the space to researchers from the Botanical Garden at New Haven, scholars who came and spent hours examining the journals and understanding the significance of what they contained. Garden clubs came and learned about Dr. Harlan Moss's hybridization techniques, and their members went back to their own gardens with new understanding of how to work with plants. Universities sent scholars to examine the journals, and several published papers based on the research, crediting the unknown botanist posthumously for the first time. The greenhouse lady, as she came to be known in Blackstone Falls, became a small legend, a woman who'd arrived with nothing, who'd been thrown out by her own daughter, who'd started again at 72 years old, and who'd uncovered something of genuine historical and scientific value, and who'd shared it freely with anyone who wanted to learn. She became the keeper of a dead man's dream, the guardian of Dr. Harlan Moss's legacy, the person who made sure that a life spent in grief and dedication wouldn't be forgotten. In the corner of her rented room above Nora's hardware store, Edith kept 2 suitcases packed, not because she was planning to leave, but because she'd learned something fundamental about her own life. Leaving could happen in an instant. The life you were living could be taken away without warning, and it was wise to always have an escape route prepared. She had lived that truth. She had experienced it. She wasn't going to be caught unprepared again. She lived in that room for 15 more years, and she never unpacked those suitcases. She became a citizen of Blackstone Falls, a beloved figure in the town, someone who'd transformed loss into legacy and survival into service. When she died at 88 years old, the suitcases were still sitting in the corner, packed and ready for a journey she never needed to take. The greenhouse stands to this day, still teaching people about the power of dedication and the way that grief, channeled correctly, can create something beautiful, something that lasts, something that changes the world in small but permanent ways. The letter came on a Tuesday in December 1971, registered mail from Pamela's attorney in Hartford. It alleged that Edith Callahan was mentally incompetent, that she'd made a rash and irrational decision purchasing worthless property at auction, that she was not capable of managing the assets now discovered on that property, and that a conservatorship should be established with Pamela as the conservator. Now let me tell you something about that letter. It was vicious. The language was calculated. It described Edith as confused, isolated, and susceptible to manipulation, and it suggested that Frank Tavares and Nora Briggs had taken advantage of her vulnerable emotional state to encourage her to make decisions that were contrary to her own best interests. It went further than that, even. The attorney claimed that Edith was suffering from psychological distress related to the loss of her marriage, and that this distress had made her incapable of rational thought. He wrote that she'd abandoned her former life without adequate planning, that she was living in precarious circumstances above a hardware store, that she'd isolated herself in a small town where she had no real connections or support system. He argued that the discovery of valuable plants and preserved specimens on the greenhouse property constituted a windfall that required oversight, that Edith couldn't possibly understand the financial implications of such a find, and that, without immediate intervention, she would squander this opportunity through naivete or, worse, through the influence of people who had their own financial motivations. The letter specifically named Frank and Nora as potential financial beneficiaries of Edith's inheritance, which was a creative way of suggesting they were manipulating her for money. Stay with me here, because this is where it gets interesting. Frank read the letter 3 times, and then he sat in his office at the county courthouse, and he felt something cold move through him. He'd seen this before. He'd processed hundreds of conservatorship petitions in his 32 years as a county clerk, and he knew exactly what this was. This wasn't concern. This was a daughter who'd been cut off, who'd expected an inheritance, and who was now watching her mother discover money in a way that had nothing to do with her. Frank called his own attorney immediately, and then he called Edith. "Don't worry," he said, and his voice was steady and certain. "I have 32 years of county clerk experience. I know how to handle this." What Frank did over the next 30 days was methodical and absolute. He understood the law in a way that most people never would, because he'd spent more than 3 decades watching it work. He knew what evidence mattered. He knew what would convince a judge. He didn't panic. He didn't get angry. He got to work. The first thing he did was file a detailed response with the court that included a comprehensive account of his every interaction with Edith from the moment she walked into the auction house in September 1971. He documented the exact wording of her questions about the property. He described her intelligence, her clear thinking, her ability to negotiate the price down from the opening bid, her understanding of the financial implications of her decision. He noted that she'd asked specific questions about property taxes, about utilities, about zoning regulations. He recorded that she'd inspected the property herself, walked the perimeter, checked the structural integrity of the buildings. He wrote that she'd studied the auction documents beforehand and come prepared with a budget and a strategy. All of this, every single detail, contradicted the narrative that she was confused or impulsive. He documented the fact that she'd been living independently before the conservatorship petition was filed, working at the library, managing her own finances, making her own decisions about where to live and how to spend her time. All behaviors, he noted, that were absolutely inconsistent with mental incompetence. Then he did something brilliant. He reached out to everyone who knew Edith and asked them to write statements for the court. He included testimony from Nora, who described Edith as sharp as a tack and twice as smart, who talked about their daily conversations, who noted that Edith made all her own decisions about work and living arrangements and how she spent her money. He included a statement from the librarian who'd worked with Edith for months, who wrote that Edith was meticulous in her attention to detail, intelligent in her approach to research, engaged and thoughtful in her interactions with patrons. He included testimony from the contractor Marcus Webb, who'd had extensive and detailed conversations with Edith about the greenhouse design. Marcus wrote that he'd never met a woman more exceptionally knowledgeable and precise in her requirements, that she understood structural principles and climate control and construction methodology in ways that suggested either formal training or genuine intellectual curiosity. Marcus noted that she'd made decisions about the greenhouse design that showed foresight and planning, decisions that would benefit the space for decades to come. These statements, Frank understood, painted a picture of a woman who was competent, intelligent, engaged, and fully capable of managing her own affairs. But then Frank did something that made Pamela's attorney's face go pale when he read about it in the court filing. Frank called Pamela's attorney directly. Think about that. He didn't hide behind lawyers. He didn't wait for the court proceedings. He picked up the telephone and he spoke to the man himself. And he said this: "I've been a county clerk for 32 years. I've filed thousands of documents. I know the law. I know the people who practice it in this state. I know when something is being filed out of pure greed, and I know the difference between a legitimate concern for someone's welfare and an attempt to steal property that doesn't belong to you. Your client would lose this case so comprehensively that she would regret ever filing it. I'm going to testify. I'm going to bring the county records. I'm going to describe her emotional volatility and her clear financial motivation. I'm going to detail her history with your client, the estrangement, the history of financial demands, all of it. I'm also going to recommend that the court consider sanctions against her for filing a frivolous action, and I can assure you that the judge will listen to me because I've worked with that judge for 2 decades. I suggest you advise your client to withdraw this petition immediately." That was it. That was enough. The petition was withdrawn 48 hours later. Pamela's attorney sent a letter saying that his client had decided not to pursue the matter, citing a change in circumstances, which everyone knew was a lie, but nobody said out loud. The message was clear. Pamela backed down. She'd miscalculated. She'd thought she could take what wasn't hers, and she'd been proved wrong in the most public and humiliating way possible. Edith never saw or heard from her daughter again. Now, here's what happened next, and you need to understand the weight of this moment. Edith had been living day to day, working at the library, making enough money to survive, renting that room above Nora's hardware store. She'd found something priceless, a lifetime's work of botanical research, preserved specimens, the journals of a man who dedicated his life to understanding plants. But she didn't keep it. She didn't hoard it. She made a decision that tells you everything you need to know about her character. She sold the rare orchid specimens, 40 individual plants that had been cultivated over Dr. Harlan Moss's lifetime, some of them going back 30 years or more, to the Yale Botanical Garden for $28,000. That's a significant amount of money in 1972. That's real money. She used a portion of those proceeds to then sell the medicinal plant seed collection to a university research program for $14,000. Those two sales alone gave her $42,000, which meant she could stop working if she wanted to. She could have retired. She could have moved somewhere warm. She could have lived a comfortable life with no obligations. But she didn't do that. She continued at the library job because she loved it and because work gave her a structure and a purpose that she needed. She understood herself well enough to know that without that structure, she would have become isolated, and she'd already spent enough time being isolated. Instead, she used the money for something else entirely. She paid Marcus Webb $15,000 to rebuild the greenhouse structure above the hatch. And I want you to understand what that meant. Marcus had to create a new structure that would allow controlled access to the underground laboratory while protecting the integrity of the original construction that Dr. Moss had created. This wasn't just hammering and nailing. This was engineering. She worked with Marcus on every detail. She wanted the greenhouse design to be functional, but also beautiful, to honor what had come before, while creating something new. She had him install electricity in the underground space, carefully, with a licensed electrician who understood her requirements and who had to work within tight constraints, because you can't just run wiring anywhere in a space that old. She created a proper climate control system that maintained the optimal humidity and temperature for preserving the remaining specimens. Those plants in their jars had been sitting in darkness for decades, and now they were going to have modern environmental controls that would protect them far better than Dr. Moss's original methods ever could. When the work was finished, the greenhouse was transformed. It was still recognizably the same structure, still maintained the character of what had been there before, but it was now a functional teaching space. Edith began inviting visitors by appointment. Agricultural extension agents came to study the specimens and learn about Dr. Moss's preservation techniques. Botany students from nearby universities came to examine the journals and understand the history of botanical science in New England. Researchers interested in the preservation of historical documents and plant specimens came to photograph the original materials and document the collection. Garden clubs from throughout Connecticut came and listened to Edith talk about Dr. Harlan Moss, about the grief that had driven him underground, about the way that his love for the natural world had sustained him through decades of isolation. She had a way of telling the story that made people understand him not as a madman, but as a man who'd found meaning in something pure and beautiful. She became known in botanical circles as the keeper of the Moss Archive, a woman who'd had the wisdom to preserve and share something precious instead of selling it to the highest bidder. And she had offers. Trust me on that. Serious offers from people with serious money. A pharmaceutical company wanted to purchase the medicinal plant collection for $200,000. That would have set her up for life, and she said no. A wealthy orchid collector from Massachusetts wanted to buy the entire remaining collection for $300,000. He came to the greenhouse himself, walked the underground space, and offered her a check on the spot. She turned him down. When people asked her why she would turn down that kind of money, she'd say the same thing every time. These belong to Dr. Moss, and he left them to the world. They're not mine to sell. She didn't own them in any meaningful sense. She was just the person who discovered them, and she understood that discovery didn't come with the right to profit from what had been entrusted to her. The suitcases stayed packed in the corner of her room above the hardware store. Year after year, they sat there in their corner, ready to go, never unpacked. Nora asked her about them once. It was probably 3 or 4 years after Edith had arrived, when it was clear that Edith was staying, that she'd made Blackstone Falls her home. Nora said, "Edith, are you ever going to unpack those suitcases?" And Edith looked at them for a long moment, and then she said something that Nora never forgot. "I learned that the life you have can be taken away in an instant. A daughter can become a stranger, a home can disappear, money can vanish. The only thing you can control is whether you're prepared to leave when the time comes. These suitcases remind me not to get too attached to anything I can't carry with me." It wasn't bitterness in her voice, it was clarity. It was the hard-won wisdom of someone who'd lost everything and survived it. She stayed in Blackstone Falls for 15 years after she found the hatch. 15 years of working at the library, of tending the greenhouse on weekends, of hosting visitors who came to see Dr. Moss's work. The greenhouse became a destination. People would plan trips to visit it. They'd come from hours away to see it, to stand in the underground laboratory that Dr. Harlan Moss had built with his own hands, to understand what one man's dedication could create. Edith lived in that small room above Nora's hardware store the entire time. She ate simple meals at Pete's place. She worked at the library shelving books and helping patrons and managing the collection. She showed people the greenhouse on the weekends, walked them through the underground laboratory, shared the journals, explained the specimens, talked about Dr. Moss and the choices he'd made and the legacy he'd left. She became beloved in Blackstone Falls, and not because she was extraordinary in any flashy way, but because she'd been broken and she'd chosen to rebuild herself into something kind and open and generous. She'd had nothing when she arrived, and instead of becoming bitter about it, instead of retreating into resentment, she'd become grateful for what she'd been given. She'd become someone people wanted to know. At 88 years old, with the suitcases still packed and sitting in the corner of her room, Edith Callahan died in her sleep. It was peaceful. It was quiet. Nora found her the next morning, and the first thing she did was open those suitcases. Inside were the few possessions Edith had arrived with in 1971, a change of clothes, a book, a photograph from her wedding day, a silver ring. Nothing of great value, nothing that couldn't be left behind, but everything that mattered, everything that meant something. The greenhouse stands to this day, and the journal of Dr. Harlan Moss is preserved in a climate-controlled display case. Visitors still come, though fewer than they used to because the world moves on and forgets. But the people who do come read about the man who buried himself underground to escape his grief, and they read about the woman who discovered his work and chose to share it instead of hiding it or hoarding it or selling it to the highest bidder. They learn about the power of finding purpose in loss, about the way that dedication can outlast decades, about the truth that some flowers only bloom after the storm, that some doors close so better ones can open, and that the life you create for yourself after everything is taken away is sometimes far more beautiful than the one you had before. The suitcases were never unpacked. The ring stayed on her finger. The photograph stayed in its place. And the work, Dr. Harlan Moss's work, preserved and honored and shared, that lives on. That's the story. If this is touching your heart, that subscribe button is right there. We'd love to have you. Thank you for walking through this greenhouse with Edith today. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that some doors close so better ones can open. Some flowers only bloom after the storm. We'll see you at the next bloom.